Hello viewers, welcome to our program today. In today's program, we shall discuss about a very important period in the English literature that's called as the Victorian period. In our program today, we shall discuss various trends prevailing in Victorian literature, the conflict between science and religion, and also, to a certain extent, we will learn about the history of the Victorian literature and its era. To begin with, at the outset rather, let's learn the objectives of this lesson. To study the period in English literature in detail and summarize it for better understanding. To analyze the period from various aspects for critical appreciation and the relation with society. Special reference to prose, poetry, and novels. Now, these are our objectives for today's lesson. Now, let us know a little about the Victorian period. The beginning of this period is randomly dated from 1830 or 1832 and sometimes 1837. It extends to the death of Victoria in 1901. Historians often subdivided the long period into three sections: early Victorian from 1848, mid-Victorian 1848 to 70, and late Victorian from 1870 to 1901. Many writings of this period were imaginative or in prose with a reflection on social, economic, religious, and intellectual issues, and also the problems of that era. Renowned poets such as Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, and Christina Rossetti, and such other novelists such as Charlotte, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and William Thackeray, and finally Thomas Hardy. Now let us begin with the session where we discuss about one of these important periods in English literature, that is the Victorian period. The term Victorian identifies as the historical era in England approximately coincident with the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. It was a time of rapid and wrenching economic and social changes that had no parallel in earlier history. Changes that made small-scale England in the course of the 19th century the leading industrial power, with an empire that occupied more than a quarter of the Earth's surface. The pace and depth of such developments, while they fostered a mood of nationalist pride and optimism about future progress, also produced social stresses, class conflicts, and widespread anxiety about the ability of the nation and the individual to cope up socially, politically, and psychologically with the cumulative problems of the age. England was the first nation to exploit the technological possibilities of steam power and steel. But its unregulated industrialization, while it produced great wealth for an expanding middle class, led also to the deterioration of rural England, a mushroom growth of often shoddy urbanization and a massive poverty concentrated in slum neighborhood. The Victorian age, for all its conflicts and anxieties, was one of the immense and variegated, often with self-critical, intellectual, and literary activities. The term Victorianism is used in critical way to represent narrow-mindedness, sexual priggishness, the determination to maintain feminine innocence, and an emphasis on social responsibility. In today's class, we are going to talk about the conflict between science and religion in the age with reference to Victorian literature and with special focus on prose and novels. Throughout the history, religion has been a dominating social factor, and in Britain during the 19th century, this kind of religious domination can be seen. Victorian era is associated in the popular consciousness with Victorian values, highly moralistic, rigid, and prudish standards of behavior. One would therefore expect to discover that Victorian society was strongly and universally religious, and that Victorians uniformly embraced the ideals exposed by Christianity. However, in 19th century, it was actually a time of philosophical turmoil and revaluation of old beliefs. There was an explosion of religious movements and revivals, both in the high church and low church traditions. On one hand, the evangelical movement flourished, and there was a revival of Puritanism and Quakerism. On the other hand, proponents of Arminians challenged the Elizabethan notion of predestination, which was key to Anglican philosophy, and members of the Oxford movement, known as Tractarianism, sought to restore the Church of England to its pre-Reformation high church status. Religious movements are Arminians, Evangelicals, Anglicans, and Ritualism in Victorian England. Timeline of the Church of England during the Victorian era: Tractarianism, the Book of Common Prayer in the Victorian era, Agnosticism in Victorian England. Now we move on to the next session of our lesson, where we discuss about science in Victorian society. Oxford English Dictionary records the use of the word scientist in the year 1840. Scientists had previously been known as natural philosophers. The surest and easiest way to penetrate the thought of any age is to study it in the systematic manner. Science stands apart, and its rules scarcely infringe upon literature at all. During the 19th century, the entities we refer to as science and religion both underwent dramatic changes. It would consequently be naive to expect to be able to find one simple and unchanging relationship between the two. The historical interest of the 19th century debates between science and religion. There is a greater historiographical significance, the way in which science and religion have been perceived in the 20th century. It was heavily influenced by the writings of the late 19th century historians of science and religion. The harmony between science and faith, mediated by some form of theology of nature, continued to be the mainstream position for most men of science and most interested individuals right up to the 1860s at least. But it did come under threat. In the 1820s and 1830s, some working class radicals saw a change of using certain versions of the sciences for practical ends. Some forms of the sciences, especially those emanating from France, seem to suggest a restricted role of God in the universe, and thus to undermine the Anglican politico-religious establishments. Such materialistic forms of science were as abhorred by most respectable men of science as they were championed by working class radicals. George Gaylord Simpson, in his book The View of Life and World of Evolutionists, said that the conflict between science and religion has a single and simple cause. It is the designation as religiously canonical of any conception of the material world open to scientific investigation. The religious canon demands absolute acceptance, not subject to test or revision. Science necessarily rejects certainty and predicates acceptance on objective testing and the possibility of continual revision. As a matter of fact, most of the dogmatic religious have exhibited a perverse talent for taking the wrong side on the most important concept of the material universe, from the structure of the solar system to the origin of man. The result has been constant turmoil for many centuries, and the turmoil will continue as long as religious canons prejudice scientific questions. Now let's move on to know a little about the trends that prevailed in the Victorian literature. To start with, Fielding tradition with loose plots. The Victorian novel continues to be largely in the Fielding tradition. The plot is generally loose and ill constructed. A mixture of strength and weaknesses. Victorian novels are extraordinary mixture of sentiment, flashy melodrama, and lifeless characters. There is much that is improbable and artificial in character and incident. Entertainment value. The Victorian novel makes interesting reading. The novelist may not construct a compact plot, but they tell the story very well. They are so entertaining that children still love to read and enjoy a novel of Dickens and Thackeray. The reader's attention is not allowed to flag even for a single moment. They do not like to give up unfinished. Panoramic value. Novels like Vanity Fair, David Copperfield, etc. are not like most modern novels concentrated wholly on the life and fortunes of few principal characters. They also provide panoramas of the whole societies. In the Victorian novel, Cecil said, 100 different types and classes, persons and nationalities jostle each other across the shadow screen of our imagination. Immense variety. The Victorian novelists have capacity of varied moods. Their ranges of mood are as widely as their range of subject. They write equally for the train journey, and for all time they crowd realism and fantasy, thrills and theories, knock out farce and effects of pure aesthetic beauty, and check by Joel on the same page. They are Galsworthy, Huxley, and Woolf. A book like David Copperfield is a sort of vast schoolboy hamper fiction with sweets and sandwiches, pots of jam with their greased paper caps, cream and nuts and glossy apples, all packed together in a heterogeneous delicacy. Imaginative rendering of reality. Not only have the Victorian novelists width and range of subject and mood, they are entertaining storytellers as well. Besides this, they have also creative imagination in ample measure. Their imagination works on their personal expertise and transforms and transmutes them. The act of creation is always performed. The creative imagination of Victorian novelists works on the settings of his story and transforms it. Humor, this is another aspect. The creative imagination is also seen in the humor of the Victorian novelist. Each of the great Victorian novelists is a humorist, and each is a humorist in a style of his own. They have created a number of immortal figures of fun. Each is comic in his own different way. There are hundreds of fine jokes and witty remarks spread over the Victorian novel. Moving on to the characterization, the Victorians are all able to make their character live. Their characters may not always be real. There may be much in them that is improbable and false, but they are amazingly and indomitably alive. They are wonderfully energetic and vital. A Victorian novel is a crowd of breathing, crying, living and laughing people. It has a crowded canvas, crowded with living and breathing individuals. Another trend is lack of high artistic standard. These novels have lack of uniformity. It is extremely unequal. It is an extraordinary mixture of strength and weakness. It is technically faulty. This is so because it is still in its infancy. It is considered as a light entertainment and not a serious work of art, and the laws of its being have not evolved. Another trend is lack of liberalism. The Victorian novels show a definite decline from the earlier English novel. Any lapse from virtue is shrouded in an atmosphere of drawing the blinds and lowering the voice. Free and uninhibited treatment of the animal side is stacking. The Victorian novel presents only a practical, one-sided view of life. The novel was the vehicle best equipped to present a picture of life lived in a given society against a stable background of social and moral values by people who are recognized like the people, encountered by readers, and this was the kind of picture of life the middle-class readers wanted to read about. The purely escapist impulse to read about a highly aristocratic world of ideal gallantry and beauty is as lacking in the typical Victorian novel reader as the desire to see the fundamental problems of the human experience projected imaginatively and symbolically through the presentation of great figures acting out their destiny on the grand scale. The Victorian novel reader did not want to be entertained and in a sense wanted to escape, but they wanted to be entertained with a minimum of literary convention, a minimum aesthetic distance. I'm sure we've heard of Charles Dickens. His period is known to be from 1812 to 1870. He, as a journalist and melodramatist, gathered these features into novels to give it a new life and new and important place in middle-class entertainment. If he learned something from 18th century novelists, especially Smollett, he learned even more from his own circumstances and observations, combining in extraordinary relish for the odd, the colorful, and the dramatic in urban life, and also in human character, with a keen for the changes which the Industrial Revolution brought into England in his time, an acute consciousness of his own lower middle class origin, and the unhappy circumstances of his own childhood, and a sentimentally humanitarian attitude towards human problems. Oliver Twist published serially his first novel, which is concentrated on specific social ills, but as always with Dickens, the force of indictment falls most heavily on the individuals who administer the attacked institution rather than on the institution as such. Oliver Twist bandied between workhouse on one hand and benevolent protection on the other. With a third sinister alternative of forcible adoption into one of the criminal gangs of London exists not so much to be saved as to illustrate the different kinds of environment into which innocence may fall. Other famous novels by Dickens are Hard Times, Great Expectations, and A Tale of Two Cities. Charlotte Brontë, another renowned female writer in Victorian age, Jane Eyre, her first published novel and the work which brought her contemporary fame, shows her writing with an almost melodramatic abandon out of her own passion, dreams, and frustrations. Parts of the book are practically straight autobiography, and other parts represent the kind of wish fulfillment which few Victorian women had the courage or the power to translate into fiction. There are elements of masochism as well as wish fulfillment and some sense of stark melodrama, but they are all fused in high temperature of narrative so that they do not stand out as such. Let's move to the next segment of this lesson where we discuss about Victorian prose. Carlyle and Mill represented in some degree the extremes between which Victorian thought moved. Mill found almost as much to protest against in the civilization of his time as Carlyle did. A very different kind of protest came from a very different quarter. Mill, though fundamentally agnostic, conceded the possible utility of religion in implementing morality and the conceivable truth of Christian claim. Christ had a special express and unique communication from God to lead mankind to truth and virtue. Carlyle, while rejecting Christian dogma, preached the Christian virtues of renunciation and self-discipline. He also preached a spiritual view of reality. A third force was provided by a powerful revival of Christianity in its ritual and dogmatic aspect. Against the rising tide of liberalism, humanism, and historical and psychological interpretation of religion, a group of churchmen began in the 1830s to set the values and ideals of that primitive Christianity which was delivered for all time by the early formularies and by Anglican divines. John Henry Newman, who belonged from the period 1801 to 1890, the greatest figure in the Oxford movement, who followed what appeared to him at least to be the logic of his position to embrace Roman Catholicism in 1845. Newman's conversion was really the end of the movement which exerted its greatest influence in the middle and late 1830s, when it was pleading for a more Catholic conception of Anglicanism. On the other hand, we have Matthew Arnold from 1822 to 1888, who took literature and literature itself. He took as a type of culture. He looked around as middle-class Victorian England. He was a humanist who devoted a large part of his life to demonstrating the central part that, as adequate literary culture, could and should play in society, and to rescue religion from the rationalist scoffers on one hand and the rigid fundamentalist and the dogmatic on the other, by propounding a liberal Christianity based on a view of Bible as poetry rather than as history of science, or as morality touched by emotion rather than as an infallible book rules. In the introduction to Ward's English Poets in the year 1880, he wrote, "Our religion has materialized itself in the fact, and now the fact is failing it. But for poetry, the idea is everything. The rest is a world of illusion, of divine illusion." Poetry attaches its emotion to the idea. The idea is the fact. The strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. The truth of Christianity cannot be demonstrated by asserting the historicity of the Bible, which is increasingly in doubt. It rests on the degree to which the Bible as poetry can provide a moving revelation of the central and moral realities of experience. I hope that you have enjoyed today's program. Thank you. We'll meet you in our next class.